Hello friends, I am Dr. Sandeep Prakash Joshi, Head of the Postgraduate Department of English at Sant Baba Amravati University. Uh, I welcome you all to the Virtual Center from Campus to College and Community channel, Virtual C4, where we have organized for you a web lecture series on the theme of COVID-19 pandemic. Friends, the COVID-19 pandemic has overtaken the world with overwhelming force and rapidity and has influenced millions of lives across the globe. It has created a huge impact on the world economy and affected lives in all sections of society, irrespective of race, religion, class, gender, and age. The assault of the virus has been so massive and so sudden that we have been caught unawares and unprepared and have found ourselves quite literally gasping for breath. We have yet not fully come to terms with the nature and far-reaching effect of the pandemic on our day-to-day lives. It has given rise to several issues of grave concern and consequences on our lives and careers in the foreseeable future. Even as we remain clueless regarding the overall impact of the pandemic on the future of humanity, the onslaught of the infection is spreading and worsening with every passing day. In such a scenario, where we have been left rather defenseless with no vaccine and efficacious medicines available, only right information and knowledge alone can help us to cope up with the challenge and threat caused by the COVID-19 scourge. Hence, under the inspiration and encouragement of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Muralidhar Sandekar, we have taken this initiative to enlighten the society through our channel where intellectuals and scholars from different fields would share their knowledge and understanding and help us to prepare and brace ourselves against the ongoing onslaught of the coronavirus. So today we have with us our distinguished guest, Dr. Prantik Banerjee, who would be enlightening us with his talk titled Migrant Microbes, Traveling Bodies, and Border Immunities in Pandemic Narratives. But before I hand over the reins to him, I would briefly read out his bio note. Dr. Prantik Banerjee is Associate Professor, Department of English and former IQAC Coordinator, Hislop College, Nagpur. He is a published poet and short story writer. His poems have featured in Sahitya Academies, Indian Literature, and various reputed journals like PEN, Brown Critic, Kavya Bharati, Journal of Poetry, Society of India, Little Magazine, etc. He was featured as the Poet of the Fortnight in Femina by the renowned Indian poet Kamala Das. Indian Express ran a weekly column of his articles. Dr. Banerjee is a noted PhD supervisor and a member of the Board of English Studies at RTM Nagpur University. He has worked as an expert on the drafting committee of NCCI's higher education policy. He has also presented the triennial conference statement of AIACHE, Christ University, Bangalore. He was also involved in the draft revision for the Kakodkar committee in a report. He has served as NAC expert and RUSA trainer and conducted many training programs for colleges and universities in India. His publications include one book, several book chapters, and numerous research articles in many illustrated national and international journals. His area of interest are cultural studies, film theory, post-colonial studies, trauma theory, disability studies. He is also interested in higher education policy and quality assurance framework. So I welcome Dr. Prantik Banerjee and ask him to deliver his lecture.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sandeep Joshi, and thank you once again for a very nice introduction. Today is the second webinar talk of this ongoing series that Sant Gadge Baba Amravati University has been organizing And let me once again express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Joshi as well as Dr. Mona Chimote, and of course, my gratitude to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Chandekar, for for inviting me to deliver a couple of talks on what I consider to be one of the most important and perhaps one of the most relevant topics that the present pandemic crisis has thrown before us. And in yesterday's talk that I delivered, which was my first web talk for this series, uh, I was examining the pandemic crisis and its impact upon literature and culture. And that was a very, the theme that I covered and the issues and the problems that were related to the topic the topic of the talk, which was actually unmasking the crisis in literature and culture during the time of mass. That was the title of my first talk. The topic that I covered yesterday was more broad and sweeping, both in its nature as well as its scope. Today's webinar topic, as Dr. Sandeep Joshi has already mentioned, the title of my talk today is Migrating Microbes, Traveling Bodies, and Border Immunities in Pandemic Narratives. Friends, ever since the pandemic crisis the outbreak has caused a complete paradigm shift in not only in our daily lives, but also in the global polity, in the body polity of globalization. There has been a lot of conversation. There have been a lot of discourses that have emerged the out of the question, out of the problematic relationship that migration of microbes and traveling bodies have had. In this context, what I would like to suggest here is that I purposefully took up a topic where normally when we talk about the word migration refers to human migration. But as the COVID-19 crisis has already unfolded and is also affecting in drastic ways our personal lives, the very concept of migration, the agents and the players and the actors who are going through this process of migration not only include human bodies, but also invisible pathogenic microbes. And therefore, I think when we talk about migration in literary studies and culture studies, or in interdisciplinary approaches to literature, I would personally, it is my wish to expand the connotation, the semantics of the word migration to include not just the movement of human population or human bodies, but to include the migration of microbes. So in my talk, I'm going to focus on the migration of microbes that travel with human bodies, microbes that transmit their deadly infection across borders and cause pandemics and pandemonium in society. To I'd like to present my thoughts before you by also sharing with you a PPT. Yeah. So this, friends, is the topic of my talk, Migrating Microbes, Traveling Bodies, and Border Immunities in Pandemic Narratives. Like I was saying, that the COVID-19 crisis we all are facing today is because of the migration of a deadly pathogen, what we call transmission. Well, transmission is also movement or migration from one point to another point. And therefore, I said that I would like to expand the scope, the meaning of the word migration to include the transmission of pathogenic diseases. So it is the migration of invisible and dangerous microbes, and that has set off what we are witnessing as the largest migration, for example, in Indian history, other than in times of war and partition. Uh, we all have been reading absolutely heart-rending stories of the manner in which more than 60 lakh, and this is what the newspaper reports are reporting, that more than 60 lakh people, mostly belonging to the working class, uh, the pandemic crisis has actually forced, they have displaced and dislocated and forced more than 60 lakh workers from different metropolitan cities, major towns and industrial centers in India, forcing them to move to places thousands and thousands of kilometers, making, desperately using all modes of transport and sometimes being forced to even walk 1,200, more than 12,000 to 1,200 kilometers. And these heartrending stories have brought us to focus on the nature of this COVID crisis and the different types of migration that it has engendered. So the very experience of the COVID-19 pandemic has made us curious to know about the nature of pathogens, their routes of transmission, their infiltration of human bodies, and the impact of infectious diseases on people. Uh, the increasing prevalence of infectious diseases in the last few decades. I mean, if we look at the last 40, 50 years, uh, humanity has been exposed to a series of outbreaks, including AIDS, for example, the AIDS epidemic, which started in the 1980s. Then we had all very all kinds of epidemic diseases, including swine flu, avian flu, then SARS and MERS and Ebola. So it's not for the first time as if that the world is facing a pandemic crisis. Uh, uh, Pathogens and epidemic diseases have been with us since the history of human civilization. But what I would like to focus in today's talk is the manner in which uh, the 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 prevalence of these infectious diseases have attracted the attention of a lot of interest, a lot of attention and interest from major filmmakers. That is, I'm going to concentrate only on Hollywood and of course, writers of best-selling novels, mostly in the genre of techno thrillers, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic fiction. So, in my talk today, I will explore how Hollywood films and best-selling novels not only give expression to our cultural obsession with contagious diseases, but also but also represent effectively our fears and anxieties of a contagion. Like I was telling you, while infectious diseases have been around us since the very beginning, and right from the beginning of human civilization, and we also, for example, when we read in history books the scourge of pandemics, we also know that even during the 16th and 17th century, the whole of Europe, including and Great Britain, for example, were afflicted by not one but three bubonic plagues, and Shakespeare himself wrote many of his plays during the time of plague. So while infectious diseases have been around us, since the very beginning of human history, their dramatization in what I call pandemic narratives seems to create an ecology of fear. And Hollywood films and best-selling novels seem to present both nature and animals as hostile hosts, to human civilization. They project pathogens as predators sneaking around human bodies, waiting to unleash their devastating virulence. And, monkeys, rats, bats, pigs, horses, flies, all seem to be out there to get us. These films, or rather, films and best-selling novels that make our popular culture seem to typify the cold Darwinian logic of natural selection and survival, wherein evolution codifies happenstance into strategy. Friends, in my talk, I wish to suggest that pandemic narratives, what I call pandemic narratives, and I'll very shortly define what I mean by a pandemic narrative. But basically, my focus would be that pandemic narratives offer a far more complex interpretation than they appear at first glance. Meaning that our reading of films and our reading and our interpretation of best-selling novels dealing with contagious diseases requires a far more nuanced and a far more complex approach. And because and I'm reading films as well as texts. I'm considering films as a visual text, and therefore my reading of films as well as best-selling novels from popular culture is to assume, or rather, is to presume that that these texts are layered with many subtexts and context, and it is these contexts and subtexts of the pandemic narratives that I will be focusing. What I will try to show is that the fear of contagion in these pandemic narratives, that these pandemic narratives throw us into, is displaced into, or rather is displaced onto non-normative bodies and to an anthropomorphized virus. My and therefore the talk that I'm going to present before you is grounded on two premises, which I will outline. The first premise of my talk is that films and literary texts do amplify fear and anxiety of the contagion to a certain extent. But they also have a prophylactic effect on us, helping us to make sense of an epidemial crisis. Our reading of films, our watching of films, and our reading of best-selling novels that deal with contagious diseases seem to affect us in multiple ways, and it is the manner in which that these forms of popular culture make us respond, influence, and impact on our individual behaviors and as well as behaviors of as a community is something that I'm interested, something that I will dwell upon in my talk. What holds my interest in examining these circuits of popular culture is not simply the storyline. Of course, the storyline of these films as well as the post-apocalyptic novels are pretty gripping in themselves, and therefore they are such a page turner. But I'm also interested in the underlying tropes that define pandemic narratives and their complex relationship, for example, with migrant microbes, traveling bodies, and border immunities, which is the subject of my talk. So my first premise is that films and literary texts shape, influence, and have a tremendous impact on our social reactions, both as individuals as well as communities. My second premise of my talk is that pandemic narratives show or describe outbreak sites, that is the location of contagious diseases, not only as breeding grounds of transmitting pathogens, but also as contact zones of racial and cultural politics. So, let me quickly jump into the topic by introducing the most important term that anchors my talk today, and that is what I call a pandemic narrative. So, what is a pandemic narrative? Friends, a pandemic narrative, according to me, is a narrative in fiction and film that repeats particular characters, images, and storylines to produce a formulaic narrative. Pandemic narratives make use of certain theoretical strategies and formal devices over and over again. And therefore, the repeated use of these, you know, set of characters, predictable set of characters, images, and typical plot lines in a large number of best-selling novels as well as Hollywood blockbusters in the last 3 or 4 decades has turned them into a set of conventions, and therefore the conventions of pandemic narrative, the tropes of pandemic narrative have been used prolifically in popular culture, so much so they provide an easily recognizable template of narration. And this is what I'm going to examine. The template of a pandemic narrative is what I'm going to examine. Uh, it's important, to realize that the COVID crisis has perhaps got a lot of people, a lot of lovers of literature to the watching of these pandemic films or to the reading of best-selling novels. Open Twitter, for example, and you will see people talking about films like Contagion, Outbreak, or the Andromeda Strain. On Netflix, for example, the documentary series Pandemic is trending these days. So my argument in my talk here really is that reading and watching these popular pandemic narratives influence our social and cultural lives. Look at the way in which the very social lexicon, the way in which the meanings and the words and the idiom that we are using these days are related to the field of biomedicine and the field of epidemic diseases. Words like quarantine and social distancing and super spreader has already become part of our are already they belong to the common parlance in which we are using, in which we are conversing, discussing, debating, and talking about the COVID crisis. So the point here is that circuits of culture, and by that I mean popular modes of information and entertainment, which are these best-selling films and best-selling novels, they make for a lot of politics. They also make for a lot of, besides entertaining us, besides disseminating information, they also make for a lot of politics, but more on that a little later. Uh, just following these narratives, watching these films and reading these bestsellers is likely to lead us to either being fearful that things could get worse, the situation could go out of hand, and therefore we are talking about an apocalypse that is almost upon us, or these bestsellers and these Hollywood films also have the opposite effect of making us feel comforted that this too shall pass and we shall overcome. What is crucial here to understand is that pandemic narratives don't simply dramatize a contagion. They plot imaginative political terrains and chart the traveling routes of deadly viruses. They also play out complex subtexts of migration, displacement, racism, communal stereotyping or stigmatization, and exploitation. It is these issues, problematic, controversial, debatable, that I will foreground in my interpretation of a few Hollywood films and a few best-selling novels, which I will use as examples to illustrate what I said was the main text of my talk, the intermesh between the migration of microbes, the migration of bodies, and border immunities. If you look at popular culture, I mean, our popular culture itself is suffused with a number of best-selling novels and hit films that deal with contagion, with a deadly contagion. I'll give you a few examples, and this slide will give you the titles of some of the films and some of the novels that are very much in circulation, that have been the favorite either lockdown reads or lockdown views. And so a few examples of pandemic narratives from popular fiction include Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain, Stephen King's The Stand, George Ryman's The Child Garden, Nicola Griffith's Ammonite, Oz Saramogo's Blindness. Then there is a book that I read recently, which is not included in the slide, Geraldine Brooks, Years of Wonders, where the subject is an outbreak of the plague in 17th century England. So examples of pandemic narratives are also, I mean, from Hollywood, there are any number of films that one can list. These are only a few. Contagion, for example, which is perhaps the most watched lockdown film in the present COVID crisis. Then there are Crazies, Outbreak, 12 Monkeys, 28 Weeks Later. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are, I mean, if you do a Google search on films on pandemics, I mean, it throws up more than 50 films, and well, so is the case with the number of pandemic narratives in fiction. Like I said, a pandemic narrative is a narrative that repeats a basic plot. I mean, it follows a standard storyline about a growing virus posing a threat to a community. Then it describes, whether it is a film or a bestseller novel, it describes or shows the ensuing panic response and social chaos. And ultimately, either both in the film as well as the novel, the narrative often ends showing the triumph of medical experts and health authorities who eventually overcome the bug. So in other words, when I say that pandemic narrative is formulaic, not only the storyline is something that is quite predictable because it repeats the same set of conventions, but the interesting conclusion that one can draw by examining films as well as pandemic fiction is that a pandemic narrative is one that maps a trajectory from social pandemonium to social equilibrium. And when I therefore said in the beginning of my talk that pandemic narratives in popular culture have an effective impact upon audiences and upon readers, I not only draw our attention to the fact that they do sometimes make aggravate our sense of panic and perhaps increase and amplify the fear of for example, the COVID crisis, but they also have a prophylactic effect in helping us to overcome, in helping us to cope up with the crisis. So just to reiterate, a pandemic narrative, as I said, is one that maps a trajectory from social pandemonium to social equilibrium. So now that we have a working definition of what a pandemic narrative is, and I've given you some examples on this slide, I'll try and show how, in the manner in which some Hollywood films and best-selling novels reconfigure, through their stories, they reconfigure our fundamental ideas about contagion, migration, and borders. And this I'll do by critically reading these narratives and examining the repetition of what I said is a certain formulaic set of tropes, which are often used in these films as well as in these best-selling novels. So the first trope is of a pandemic narrative is that it is it is a mythic narrative. A pandemic narrative is a mythic narrative in the sense that it presents the story as an epic battle, a battle of human protagonists against against a cunning and deadly virus. I mean, in many popular novels and Hollywood films, the protagonist is often shown to be a medical professional or a research scientist. And he or she, I mean, whether it is a female or a male lead character, they are shown to use their intelligence, their pluck, or their resourcefulness in order to detect, expose, and outwit a sly pathogen with a self-mutating ability. But here is the catch. This is something interesting, that after all, mythic battles, for example, in all classical stories, classical legends, also need not only heroes, they also need formidable antagonists, not only protagonists, heroic protagonists, but also formidable antagonists, because heroes, after all, need enemies. And what I find interesting in the pandemic narratives of Hollywood films and these best-selling novels is that the enemy is not just cast in the form of, like I said, the chimerical, the shape-changing and mutating pathogens, but the menace and the source of evil is often traced, or rather transposed, from the migrating microbe to migrants, to human migrants and human travelers, who are often shown as outsiders, who are often shown as the archetypal stranger. And very often it is these human characters who are racially stereotyped. And I'll give you a few. I'll give you these examples more in detail as I move into my talk. Let me in fact give you a straight example from the film Contagion. Like I said, Contagion is probably the most watched lockdown film. This is a film that came out in 2011. It's a medical thriller, a techno thriller made by the very famous American director Steven Soderbergh. The film, it presents us with a mythic narrative. One of the female lead characters in the film is is shown to be is a U.S. epidemic intelligence officer. The role is played by the character is played by Kate Winslet. So Kate Winslet is a U.S. epidemic intelligence officer who investigates a global outbreak but loses her own life in the battle with the virus. So the film celebrates her and a few other characters as heroic warriors, like the COVID warriors that we talk about in today's crisis. So these characters are shown to fight not only to contain the pandemic, not only to contain the contagion, but to save humanity itself. But one of the ironies in the film, perhaps completely unintentional, is to show how the unchecked border crossing of this epidemic intelligence officer, she keeps traveling between Washington, Minneapolis, and Hong Kong, and in the process of her seamless movement, from one place to another, crossing international borders, she becomes a threat to global health. So the film's visuals, conflate the spread of contagion with the unchecked movement of people that technologies of travel and communication facilitate. So the narrative of the pandemic throws up the internal contradictions of the process of globalization itself. What is interesting about the film is that it projects the heroic action using the common trope of binaries in an epic battle. The battle, or the epic battle, or the mythic battle, is often shown to take place between a heroic traveling human, like the epidemic intelligence officer in the film Contagion, versus a male-fissioned migrating microbe. So the microbe, again, is attributed with a consciousness, with a diabolical intent. It is, in a sense, it is therefore anthropomorphized, and like a character from the film Outbreak says that if you want to shake hands with one of these viruses, you had better wear a spacesuit. So the very discourse or the very narrative, the dialogue, the visuals that are presented in the film or in the novels that I'm referring to, present the migrating microbe or the threat from the microbe in terms of an enemy that is anthropomorphized, that is spoken of in human terms. Um, uh, to give you another example, a very famous non-fictional book, which was adapted, which was the basis for its filmic adaptation in Outbreak, is a book written by Richard Preston. And interestingly, the book is titled The Hot Zone, and the film Outbreak, as I said, was based on the book. Hot Zone was a book that came out almost coincided with the outbreak of the Ebola virus in Africa, and there is, in the narration of, it's a non-fiction book, but in Richard Preston's, I came upon this line which just emphasizes, which proves the point that I'm making, that in pandemic narratives, the migrating microbe is presented often as an antagonist, as an enemy in human terms. And so I'm going to quote from the book, and where Preston said, referring to the virus, he says, it looked real, it felt real. He experienced what he would later describe as a major pucker factor setting in. This is the major pucker factor. This is a term that is referred to the virus, and major pucker factor is a military slang that refers to the body's tightening sensation in response to fear. The point I'm trying to illustrate here is that even in a non-fiction scientific book like Richard Preston's Hot Zone, the microbe, the invisible microorganism, is presented or is being talked about in human terms, and therefore it is anthropomorphized. And this actually sets the tone for the mythic battle. So it's a battle between heroic human warriors against an invisible but deadly disease-carrying virus. And in a sense, therefore, the epicness of this battle is dramatized by posing human forces of science, medicine, and technology against an anthropomorphized nature in the form of the microbe. But the crux of the matter is this, and here I'm reading or trying to uncover the subtext of the pandemic narrative. So the crux of the matter is this, that the humanity that heroic warriors are trying to save in these mythic narratives, the humanity and its survival that the protagonist fights for, is a humanity of the West. And as I will show, this is one of the many ways in which the pandemic narratives are infected with racial bias and prejudice. Pandemic narratives are often problematic in the manner in which they plot the contagion terrain with the help of, as I said, formulaic tropes. One often repeated trope is that of containment itself. The problem of how does one contain the disease, as it is shown in Hollywood films, for example. So the problem with pandemic films is that even as they show through the storyline, through characters coping with the outbreak, they seem to raise a fundamental question, and that is: Are all human bodies do all human bodies matter in the same way? They seem to pose a question, an un, a coded question, that who is expendable and who is not in this battle for survival between mankind and a deadly natural microorganism. And I'll quickly give you an example here again from another very popular Hollywood film, Outbreak. Like I said, Outbreak was in fact based on Richard Preston's non-fiction book, The Hot Zone. Now, what is interesting here is that in the opening scenes of this film, uh, we are shown American troops, uh, we are shown a mercenary camp. We are shown a mercenary camp in North Africa, in a place called, in fact, it is identified as Zaire, which is a banana republic in in North Africa, and possibly the seat of American-sponsored terrorism. And so in the opening scene, the film shows American troops aerially blowing up this mercenary camp. And the reason is that the American military believes that this camp uh, is, the site for the outbreak of a viral disease whose source of infection is, in fact, the monkeys from African jungles. Now, the way in which the scene is played out, and I'll just move on to show you another slide. This is the way in which the film starts. And as you can see, I've given you a collage of visuals in the opening scenes. So as you can see that there is the Mi-6 American helicopter, and then there is the camp that is shown, and then just skirting the camp, in fact, are the thick jungles of Africa. And you can see how the people on the ground, in fact, think the man with his arms akimbo is somebody who believes that the Americans are coming to rescue these people, these natives, these locals from being victims of the contagion. Now, there's the whole scene is played out in a few minutes with an impressive visual, with impressive visuals like of hovering helicopters, then the US Army men in battle fatigues, and then the US medical experts wearing proper biomedical suits, what we call the PPE kits these days. Now, at the end of the scene, where, as I said, the chopper bombards and reduces the camp to dust, the body count, it leaves a trail of bodies on the ground, and the body count is made up mostly of blacks and of the American, or rather the African guerrillas. In the film, so this is the way in which the film moves from this visual, and then a couple of scenes later, the film shows another scene which shows the same suspected virus resurfacing 20 years later in a small isolated town in Southern California. And people begin to die in large numbers in this Southern Californian town. The situation that the film shows is more or less the same. The American military is facing again an epidemic crisis. A town has to be isolated, it has to be quarantined, and once again, the military and the civic authorities have to take a decision. And the decision is whether whether to destroy the place or not. Now, this is crucial. In sharp contrast to the extermination of the camp, of the military base or the military camp in Zaire in Africa, faced with the same situation, the American authorities, refused to eliminate, refused to exterminate this particular town, because, as one of the top military officials says, that these people are Americans, these are our people, and these are Americans, and therefore there is no question of eliminating this small town. But they did that in Zaire. They wiped out a camp having no less than 20,000 people. So clearly, the point that I'm trying to make is that in the heroic narrative of pandemics, not all bodies matter. Uh, Racial typologies of bodies make some people expendable, others not. Friends, what pandemic narratives and are stories, pandemic narratives from popular culture, whether it is films or whether it is best-selling fiction, are are stories, and stories have consequences. What is important to realize is that pandemic narratives and the use of medical and scientific terminology also have consequences. I mean, in their dissemination of facts mingled with fiction. The narratives plot imaginative terrain, they plot the traveling routes, and they show border immunities of the contagion. But the fictional plots, as I have said, deeply deeply influence the ways in which we think and respond to crisis, the way in which we respond to other people or other communities. Films, after all, films and fiction are influential transmitters in our circuits of culture, and they do affect our belief and our value systems. And therefore, the story, language, and information used in pandemic narratives powerfully control and direct our reception. This is, this is especially true in the case of the film Contagion. And I go back to the film Contagion. As compared to other Hollywood films, Contagion was heavily invested in the science of epidemics for background research of its plot. I mean, in the making of the film's producers and directors constantly collaborated with medical scientists and doctors, so that they could make a story which was convincing and realistic enough of an actual outbreak. So the film's production unit consulted medical experts at every stage of the making of the film. Interestingly, after the COVID outbreak, the present crisis, the cast of the Contagion movie, including Matt Damon and Kate Winslet, and the original screenwriter of the movie, Scott Burns, they all collaborated with medical experts to release a series of public service announcements in the month of March this year to raise public awareness just after the COVID crisis, burst on the scene. So the film convincingly, I mean, I'm referring to Contagion. So the film convincingly depicts the trajectory of the virus and its vectors, and thereby it acquired a scientific aura. In fact, movie critics in their write-ups, when, as I said, Contagion became the most watched movie, it went to the top of the charts, even beating the Harry Potter series during the lockdown time. And movie critics also, it invited the attention of movie critics, and there were people who re-reviewed and talked about the film Contagion. And many of the movie critics who reviewed the film Contagion in these lockdown times, in fact, gave a statutory warning to the viewer, saying that if you're panicked right now, then don't watch the movie. Give the movie a pass. That clearly shows that the realism, the scientific realism of a contagious outbreak that the film showed, was often perceived to spike up our own panic and fear, and therefore even the movie critics felt that they should that people who are susceptible to perhaps to fear and anxiety and depression should not watch this movie. Such is the realism of the film. Its own cinematography, the cinematography of the film illustrates my point. As you can see on the slides, everything that we see the men in the PPE or the biomedical suits, and then the aftermath of the outbreak shows the streets in New York and this littered with garbage, and there is generally a pandemonium, a social chaos. So all of this, seems to illustrate that what we were watching in real in cinema was actually happening right in our neighborhood, in our cities, in our towns. And what is of particular interest is that the pandemic narrative in the film is the cinematography. So the camera, the camera's movement in the film, its slow panning, its close-ups, they hold the viewer's gaze on things that fill us with a sense of dread and foreboding. Scene after scene, in the film, the camera focuses on doorknobs, credit cards, empty glasses, napkins, airplanes, handshakes, all of these in close-ups as indexical images of the contagion. And so in the film, the epic intelligence officer, for example, there is a scene where Kate Winslet, as the epidemic intelligence officer, is explaining to the civic authorities what we now understand by the term fomites, to show how the contagion, how the disease is spreading, the way in which the microbes are migrating. The film also shows, almost in a sequence of shots, the day of the index case, what we now call the index case, and the index case, of course, is the first case of the epidemic disease carrier, and in the film, this index case is that of another fictional character played by Gwyneth Paltrow. She's given a name. The character's name is Dept Emhoff, and she's shown in the film as an American corporate executive who's traveling from Macau, from Hong Kong to Minneapolis. And in the course of her travel, the film shows that she visits a casino where, while waiting to catch the flight, she visits a casino where she blows on dice. She has a drink at a bar. She pays for the drink with a credit card and touches a bowl of nuts. All of these in slow motion, and the close-ups of these objects now make us cringe with fear. As audiences, we cringe with fear because we realize now that knowing the language of now being so familiar with the language of epidemic diseases, we know that these are all fomites. So, so the transmission route traced by the pathogen is shown in the film Contagion with great dramatic effect, and it actually puts when you're watching the film, it puts you on the edge. So the sense of menace in the film is further intensified as the camera lingers with shots of airports, buses, shopping malls, hospitals, all of these places which in real time now we are so afraid to venture. And all of them are shown in the film Contagion as pathways by which the microbe migrates. And this is precisely my point. My point is that films like Contagion play a crucial role in maneuvering what audiences make of pandemics. And if I can enumerate it, the way in which our audience response is regulated, maneuvered, in basically two ways. First, in the process of visually categorizing, the film visually categorizes threatening situations, and in the process of visually categorizing situations that pose danger, situations where which are threatening to humans, the film also ends up categorizing characters as threatening, or rather I should say characters as certain sets of people belonging to a certain race or belonging to a certain certain place. I'll just elaborate that point a little in more detail a little later. Second, the second way in which the pandemic narrative maneuvers and manipulates audiences, that it leads audiences to believe that despite it being an imaginative representation, that the epidemic in Contagion is after all a cinematic representation, but the film's deep research makes us feel as though it is a narration of facts. And by so doing, the film problematizes the issues of truth claims in the public sphere. This is what I will take up in the next in the next section. As the slide shows, you know, the history of human migration is coterminous with the history of microbial migration. And the story of humanity and the story of infectious diseases have one common thread. Both involve actors who are mobile and actors who are born across in bodies. So pandemic narratives, another trope of a pandemic narrative is that they depict several pathways of migration of microbes. One pathway is of a migration of human to human transmission of the disease, like typhoid, for example, or yellow fever or tuberculosis, where the disease, the virus actually moves from human to human. The second type of migration is from animal to human, and which many epidemic diseases in the past, like SARS, MERS, and Ebola, illustrate. So, however, sometimes the virus also takes on an intermediary host moving from one animal to another before reaching humans, as was the case in SARS or the avian flu. Popular films and popular best-selling novels show these many routes of transmission, these many kinds of microbial migration. Let me give you one interesting case of the first type of migration of microbes, human to human, and how it was represented in popular media or popular culture. This is the famous case of what is known today as Typhoid Mary in medical history. Now, Typhoid Mary's actual name was Mary Malone, and she was an Irish immigrant who moved to the United States in the 1880s to work as a cook for wealthy families on the West Coast. She was detected to be the first human carrier of the highly infectious typhus virus. However, in spite of the advice and in fact the request of medical authorities and the town authorities where she lived, she continuously defied orders, and to an extent that she went into hiding, and she would take on different disguises in order to move from one small city, from one town to another in the West Coast. But she was tracked down. But not before she had already spread the disease. She was tracked down like in the manner in which we track down what is called today the first case. So she was tracked down and put into quarantine. She was transported to an island where she stayed for the rest of her life in isolation, almost like a Robinson Crusoe, for nearly 26 years before she died. Now, her unusual story, this unusual story of Typhoid Mary, is something that grabs our attention simply because she, in pandemic narratives, in popular culture, she is what I call the mythic archetype of the pestilent immigrant. The pestilent immigrant, the immigrant, the migrant who actually moves from one place to another and carries a disease and threatens to infect a healthy Western society. And I'll touch that point a little further, a little later on. So the telefilm, there was a documentary and a TV movie that was made in the 1990s on this very famous Typhoid Mary case, and the telefilm on her was provocatively titled "The Most Harmless and the Most Dangerous Woman in America." Now, the thing about the film is that the narrative seems to portray her as a victim, whereas documented records of her case seem to suggest that she went about willfully doing exactly what doctors told her not to do. As I said, she continued to defy authority. She continued to put herself in quarantine and self-isolation. And she continued to cook in other people's houses. So her act of criminal negligence, as recorded by the documents that medical reports also that are available from that time, show. So here is an interesting example of a film based on a real case, which kind of presents the character in a different light, in a problematic light altogether, because the film, when we watch the film, it kind of compels us to react in opposite ways. Some see Typhoid Mary as the migrant as an unfortunate victim, and while others watching this film might see the migrant as a sociopathic super spreader. This brings me to another rich term, medicalized nativism. And this term I deliberately bring into our discussion because this term, once again, focuses our attention that when we talk about diseases and their migration, it is not simply the spread of a disease that we are talking about, but we are trying to find out the interlinks or the intersections between the spread of the disease, as well as that is the migration of the microbes with the migration of people, and how in the process of movement of certain groups of people, they are stigmatized, they are racialized. Because remember that the history of epidemics shows that immigrants and migrants have not only been mythified as archetypal strangers, but they have often been scapegoated as the pernicious outsider, the pestilent other. I mean, if you look at American medical records or American medical histories, since the 17th and 18th century, American societies have always reacted, sometimes in very violent and aggressive manner, to the influx of Jews and Chinese people. So it is this this social behavior of a host community or a majority society to the immigrant community or the immigrant minority that the historian Alan Crott coins the term, medicalized nativism. And it shows how how societies in Europe and America at different times have stigmatized, like I said, immigrant groups coming from the rest of the world, especially as the Chinese, the Italians, the Irish. Mary Mallon was an Irish immigrant, and if we remember that during the outbreak of AIDS, it was the Haitians from South America, or the Haitians from Latin America, who became the targets of social prejudice and social bias. So immigrant groups have always been, connected with communicable diseases. And Crott's the term medical nativism involves, points out that, that it's not just about superimposing a disease threat on an unfortunate group, because the disease marks the social practices of the marginalized group as dangerous. It shows their very culture. It's not as if the Chinese were spreading the disease or the Irish were responsible for spreading a particular disease. It was as if something was pathogenically wrong with their culture itself. So the intrinsic differences between the culture of American societies and the culture of non-Western Oriental people, for example, led to social stigma, led to social prejudices, and in a way causing a lot of social discrimination. Immigrants, as I said, were were treated almost like untouchables. So, and this becomes very obvious if you look at the way in which President Trump reacted, how quickly, for example, after the COVID-19 outbreak, the American president called the outbreak as the yellow peril, and called the virus, the COVID-19 virus, as the Chinese virus. So, even, and media coverage, especially in America, played up in an endless loop. It showed us visuals of the alleged primitive practices on the Guangzhou farms and the squalid conditions in the Wuhan wet markets. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the visual grammar of media, that is of popular, which is part of the popular culture, it becomes popular culture, and its narratives become powerful channels for shaping, controlling, and orchestrating, forming public perception, public opinions. Like the case of the patient zero, like everyone after the outbreak, even after COVID-19 happened in India, even we were all, morbidly trying to find out who is the patient zero, who was the first patient to be infected in India. And seriously, aren't we now witnessing the same prejudices that Alan Crott pointed out by using this word, medicalized nativism? Aren't we now witnessing the same prejudices, the same formation of biases in stereotyping, for example, migrants and domestic servants in our country, in our houses, as potential carriers and treating them as untouchables? I mean, this is the worst case of medical nativism. So the intermesh of the migration of microbes with the migration and stigmatization of certain people and certain places is something that, as I said, that I've been trying to show makes the subtext of pandemic narratives. So one of another trope of pandemic narratives, which I find very disturbing, is that pandemic narratives always seem to present the originating place of migrating microbes as what I call a geography of disease and a topography of moral pollution. It kind of maps the contagion route and reveals a distinct bias in the origin of infectious diseases. At the risk of overreacting, maybe, I would say that Conrad's heart of darkness continues to darken many a pandemic narrative in modern times. So films like Contagion or the Andromeda Strain seem to suggest, they show an infectious disease as a local infestation, beginning as a local infestation somewhere out there, and then to globalize it with a full-grown outbreak. What happens in the process is that the narrative tends to create what many social scientists have called penetration panic. Penetration panic really means that, are we also going to get infected? Will the migrants come and transmit the disease to us? And that is what we call penetration. What we mean by fear that is spread through penetration. Penetration meaning when the outsider becomes the insider and thereby penetrates borders that are both visible and borders that are invisible. So this tendency of pandemic narrative is a tendency that pathologizes certain places and people and sometimes entire population. Just to give you an example, once again, from non-fiction, and I refer to Richard Preston's The Hot Zone. Here again is a passage where Preston is writing about the possible source, the threat that the world faces from contagious diseases. And what I want you to pay attention to is the language of that passage. So it reads, a hot virus in the rainforest lives within a 24-hour plane flight from every city on Earth. All the Earth cities are connected by a web of airline flights. The web is a network. Once a virus hits a net, it can shoot anywhere in a day. Paris, New York, Los Angeles, wherever planes fly. Two things are noticeable here. One is, notice that the passage obliquely establishes a particular place as a geography of disease. I mean, the suggestion that the hot virus comes out from rainforest is to suggest places that are very specific in their geographical locations. Places, for example, in Africa, South America, or Asia. Notice also that the phrase used in this passage by Richard Preston, referring to every city in the world, is quickly shortlisted in the next sentence to Paris, New York, and Los Angeles. So, it seems to locate of the disease in third world countries and moving towards the first world countries. And often films like Contagion and Outbreak, through their visuality, seem to highlight images of these places as ridden and infested with poverty and squalor. So Hollywood films therefore visually locate diseased bodies within the spatial and temporal distant locales of what I call pre-modernity, as if, that the disease comes only from places in third world countries or from the global south, because these represent cultures and societies that are not modern but pre-modern. So such images, reify the relationship between first and third worlds as that of the scientific investigator and the lab specimens. And of course, by that I mean is that scientific investigators, like the mythical heroes of the first trope of pandemic narratives, coming all from the West, and then examining, studying, and examining bodies and sources of the disease in the third world countries or the global south, which are considered to be the sites of these contagious diseases. So the population who make for these lab specimens are also racialized. They also are stereotyped. So the subtext of pandemic narratives, the prevalence of certain cinematic tropes in films like Contagion and Outbreak reminds one of the extensive circulation of imperial tropes in cultural discourses that, for example, Edward Said highlighted in Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism. In these discourses, places in the East, Far East, or Near East, Said has shown were to the Western imagination sources of fear and sources of fantasy. And such places were often linked not only to death, decay, and disease, but also to a certain moral turpitude, thereby stereotyping, the locals and the natives as a savage race. That's the reason I said that Conrad's Heart of Darkness seems to darken many a pandemic narrative, even in today's popular culture. So popular films and fictions, therefore, one may conclude, show infectious diseases migrating from Africa and Asia to advanced countries in the West, from the global South to the global North. It is never, never the other way around. So, when I refer to President Trump calling the COVID-19 virus as a Chinese virus, this is how some of the racial tropes of pandemic narratives is played out in the field of global politics. And because after all, I mean, in President Trump's remark, what we find is a strong anti-Asian prejudice, as if with his remark, as if he put an entire community, an entire race on notice, as if to suggest that, that you are the other and you endanger us by your presence. So the process of othering that Said talks about in Orientalism as well as in Culture and Imperialism contaminates pandemic narratives itself. It is unquestionable, therefore, that there is a sort of an ethnic profiling of a disease that is shown in the manner in which films and best-selling novels marginalize some people epidemiologically, not just epidemiologically, but also socially. It's a big word, epidemiologically, but also socially. Remember also that in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, when I was referring to how migrants and immigrants are looked upon as threats, as outsiders, as disease-carrying vectors. Remember that after the COVID crisis, today 170 countries have barred immigrants from entering their territory. So we are not just talking about racial stereotyping in films, it's happening in the real world of politics. I'll touch upon one final trope of pandemic narrative, and this is crucial to those of us who have watched the film Contagion or the film Outbreak, or those of us who would want to watch the film. I would strongly recommend people to watch this film Contagion to get what I'm trying to say. The last trope of a pandemic narrative, which the time constraint allows me to talk about, is border immunities and border promiscuity. And this is, I feel that the pandemic narrative is often anchored on a trope that congeals, that combines border immunity with border promiscuity. There is a strong link and an association between the crossing of borders and the crossing of certain moral codes. And let me explain this from a scene from the film Contagion. This is a scene. This is an opening scene of the film Contagion, and we are shown here an American corporate executive, Dept, who is about to board a flight from Hong Kong to Minneapolis, and it is while she's waiting in transit, as you can see the picture. She receives a phone call, and she's holding the mobile on her left hand, which also shows her ring finger, her wedding finger rather. So there's a wedding ring on her finger. And I'll just quickly read out the transcript of the dialogue that takes place between her, and there is a man on the other side of the phone. So she says, "Hey," she answers, and then there is a big grin on her face. She holds the phone to her ear, and she says, the man over the phone says, "Yes, I'm John Neal here. You just had sex with me in a hotel room and left without saying goodbye." "Yeah, and ended up being delayed. So sorry, I was panicking," she responds. "If I don't get to see you again, I just wanted to say it was nice to see you again." So Beth says, "It was nice to see you too." And then the man says, "And listen, use the other email I gave you, because that's the only secure one, okay?" And Beth coughs. Even as she's speaking over the phone, she's coughing. And so the man says, "Are you all right?" And Beth says, "Yeah, I'm just a bit jet lagged and I'm feeling tired." And John, the conversation ends by John saying, "Look, you should go home and get some rest. Hong Kong is a long way away." As the film moves further, as the action moves further, we realize that Beth's persistent cough and tiredness is actually the first symptoms of her being infected by the deadly virus. And most significantly, it seems to me that the movie projects, of course, I mean, the figure of Beth is supposed to be the celebratory figure of the success of globalization. After all, she is shown as the American corporate executive, crossing international borders, moving in different time zones as easily as one would surf the internet, and therefore she seems to be the triumphant figure of globalization's success stories. This success story of globalization is, I feel, is undercut by another trope of pandemic narrative, and that is that the trope of traveling bodies, breaching border immunities, is also suggests a transgression of some moral code. Sometimes, I mean, so characters, when they move, characters who are carriers of diseases are often shown in pandemic narratives as either people who abuse drugs, or who are into illicit sex, or who are into arms trafficking. So what the film does is, as a subtext, is that when it returns us, when it shows the sequence of it traces the movement of death. It also not only epitomalizes the border, but it also sexualizes the gaze. So when we're looking at the character in the film, we are not only looking at it from the gaze of a disease, but we are looking at it in a sexualized way. And it is this underlying subtext that seems to suggest that the root of a pathogen is as secretive as the course of illicit love or an adulterous affair. So migrating microbes, in pandemic narratives move, they break, they enter into human bodies, which are often shown to be promiscuous and profligate. So the scandal of a pathogenic outbreak occurs together with the scandal of a sexual liaison. Friends, as I've demonstrated that in pandemic narratives, the disease migrates almost without exception from the east to the west, or from the global south to the global north. And this cultural trope has played an important part in producing certain social formations which have intensified existing stereotypes, which has intensified racial prejudices and social stigma. Uh, the concept of otherness that I was referring to, Edward Said's otherness that I was referring to a few minutes back. One of the important works that has actually looked at the phenomena of contagious diseases from the point of view of racial profiling and social stigma is this very important scholarly work done by David Nirenberg, and his work on pandemics is called Communities of Violence. And it points out, it traces the history of pandemics right from the time of 15th and 16th century Europe, and to suggest that even the outbreak of plagues from the 16th and 17th centuries, known as the Black Death, that struck the world, was taken to be a disease spread by minority migrant groups such as Jews and Muslims. So the stereotyping and the stigmatizing of migrants has been there right from the beginning of human migration, of human travel. And therefore we must remember that the history of colonization and the history of infectious diseases, they have a palimpsestic relationship. One is layered upon the other. And since the beginning of the 16th century, the colonial occupation of native lands was accompanied by the import and export of several diseases. And so while many deadly tropical diseases like cholera and yellow fever were brought to England and Europe by their sailors, by their soldiers, by their missionaries, medical histories also established the fact that Europeans made, for example, in America, Native Americans in America, the Red Indians in America, for example, vulnerable to a host of their diseases that included smallpox, chickenpox, diphtheria, influenza, as well as sexually transmitted diseases, which the Native Indians or the Red Indians were never prone, they were never susceptible to, until the Europeans brought it to their own lands. So the pandemic narrative often, therefore, is a perversion of this colonial medical history that I'm talking about. It compulsively maps the chain of contagion. To dispel, of course, the fear that disease is everywhere and no one is safe. And I've tried to show that, by giving you examples from films like Contagion and Outbreak, and also referring to best-selling novels like The Andromeda Strain. I'll come to one last significant point by referring once again to the film Contagion. I've used this film as the most important illustrative example of my ideas and arguments in my talk. The film ends where it begins. In fact, just to give the film, the way in which the film was made, to impart to it more scientific realism, it takes the action. The film takes us through the action, through the story, by by sequencing it as day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. However, with one exception, that the film actually begins with day 2, but ends it when it ends. It returns the viewer to day 1, and day 1 therefore is shown as a flashback in the film. And in this flashback, what we are shown is the path that the American corporate executive Beth Emhoff takes, and the manner in which it shows the manner in which she is actually infected. She gets infected by the virus. So in a quick montage, the film shows in a flashback a bulldozer owned by a mega American corporation pulling down a banana tree while clearing a rainforest in China. This disturbs the natural habitat of bats, and one bat takes shelter in a pig farm and drops a piece of banana, which is eaten by a pig. And so the pig is slaughtered and is brought to the kitchen of the Macau casino, where the chef handles it to prepare a dish. And Beth calls out the chef from the kitchen to shake his hand, perhaps to, as you can see, Beth is holding and shaking the chef's hands, perhaps to compliment him. This is day 1. Although this day 1, as I said, is shown in the very end of the film, but it leaves the reader with some disturbing thoughts. The origin, for example, the fade out of the scene seems to suggest the origin of the disease in Asia, the association of the place with wet markets in China, the manipulation of, there's a certain manipulation of the viewer's perspective, and resulting in how we attach blame or stigma onto the other. The chef, the Chinese chef, now becomes the other. So, one would not be completely wide of the mark to suggest that the film's ending, the contagious popularity of a film like Contagion itself hides the contamination of racial and ethnic bias. And so one is led to conclude that the film, with its careful orchestration of visual and rhetorical tropes, serves an ideological purpose. And one of my conclusions, therefore, is that in films like Contagion and Outbreak, the iconography of the place is fused either with a human career, like the Chinese chef, or an animal in Outbreak, for example, like the African monkey, to suggest a racialized origin from a place that is far away from its eventual place of outbreak, and that is the West, that is America or Europe. Pandemic narratives, therefore, have a certain racialized. They bring into focus, they foreground a certain racialized imagery of the contagion, and this in itself, the narrative itself, seems to present a teleological progression from a diseased pre-modern third world to a modern sanitized first world. And so, as final comments, I hope in my talk today what I've been able to do is to demonstrate that films and fiction are rich textual sites that help us to interrogate the politics of contagion, the politics of careers, and the politics of border surveillance. And so by reading pandemic narratives from the point of view of popular culture, we hope to make, to uncover their deep and invisible investment, issues of race, issues of neo-colonialism, issues of globalization and transnational migration. So notwithstanding, whether their agenda is implicit or explicit, but popular fiction and films on pandemic narratives do play a crucial cultural role, because they engage, they amplify, and they make us rethink about the migration of microbes, the migration of bodies, and border immunities. I'll conclude my talk by leaving you with certain questions that probably I feel can be new areas of research in literature, because they particularly are important in terms of in doing interdisciplinary research. And I would actually welcome any young researcher wanting to do his PhD to take up any of these. The bottom of the slide, two particular areas that I find interesting as in post-pandemic times: pandemic literary studies, and then one could also research in the broader area of migration, disease, and trauma literature. So finally, in all our discussion about pandemic narratives and their contagious diseases, it leaves us with a certain set of questions. For example, what is the relationship between pandemics and geopolitics? How will the politics of the future play out, and how will it affect our personal lives and the lives of nations? For instance, the relationship of nations. What new forms of political belonging are engendered by the global epidemic? Will Benedict Anderson, the very famous post-colonial theorist, his notion of the nation being of imagined communities, will it change into a nation of immunity communities? And will the pandemic create new epidemiologies of belongings shaped by real or imaginary resistance to the disease? And finally, will the future of the human race be a safe future? Well, we can only hope for the best and hope that the pandemic crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, gets over soon, and the good times, that is normal, what we have come to know and be familiar with, normal times, return. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a wonderful lecture by Dr. Prantik Banerjee. I'm really thankful to you. Dr. Prantik Banerjee has beautifully deconstructed layers of social, racial, moral discrimination and ethnic discrimination underlying the pandemic narrative. The idea that powerfully comes up is how literature can wittingly or unwittingly shape up and reinforce social and moral biases. On behalf of the VC4 channel, I thank Professor Prantik Banerjee for accepting our invitation. It was a treat to hear him. I also thank our technical team and members of the VC4 channel committee for their immense help and cooperation. I also thank the audience for their keen participation. Hope to see you soon, friends.